Good evening, everybody. So the moon. We've all seen the moon. We know people visited there a little bit over 50 years ago. And NASA wants to go back as early as 2024, and we'll talk about that. And we're going to talk about not only that, but why we want to go and how we plan to do it this time. So, of course, the moon's been in the night sky since we were just primordial sludges climbing out of the ocean or whatever. And of course, Galileo is the first person to have trained a telescope on the moon way back when. And of course, he could discern its craters and its rays. And of course, it contributed to the downfall of the geocentric model of the solar system and the universe, because the moon was not perfect. And of course, in the 20th century, we started sending probes there. Last count, we've sent like well over 30 probes to the moon of various kinds, orbiters and landers and everything else, and of course people. And up until the 20th century, no one had ever seen the far side of the moon. And with apologies to Pink Floyd, there is no dark side of the moon, okay? So this is the very first picture taken by, Luna 3 in October of 1959 by the Russians of the far side of the moon. Even I almost said back the dark side. Okay, people do. And you can see these blurry features here, the Sea of Moscow up in the upper right, the Sea of the Edge. On the left-hand side there, some of that's almost visible sometimes with the moon. And I want to point out something. The reason why we never see this side is because the moon is what's called tidally locked with the Earth. There is a slight shift in the center of mass towards the Earth, and over eons, the moon stopped rotating. Well, it rotates one time in a month around its axis, and it basically keeps it aligned with the same side looking at the Earth. Now, there's a slight wobble of about 1.5 degrees or so over time, but basically, sometimes you can see a few of those features on the edge, and sometimes you can't. But anyway, this is the first picture. Now, let's flash forward, let's say 50 years. And this was taken in 2011 by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. And this is now your high-definition picture of those same features. And we've made a few improvements in our technology. Now, of course, I don't know where you were, but I was 12 when we landed on the moon. And it still gives me goosebumps.
I'm going to step off the left now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for...
Oh, I put the wrong video in. I'm sorry. Now, of course, we really did land on the moon, but I just had to do that, okay? So we really landed on the moon. Uncle Neil was there. I'm really not related, but we call him Uncle Neil anyway. And Neil and Buzz landed on July 20th, 1969. If you actually believe the first video, then there's a great Mythbusters where they went through every one of the myths about the lunar landing and show how what we've seen and what was brought back and everything is real. And we've actually seen moon rocks, so I know they're real. And if you know a NASA guy, you know one, if it was a secret, we wouldn't keep it very well. So, so basically in the late 60s, early 70s, we sent a total of 12 people to the moon. And we even drove a car on the moon. And in total, we brought back about 842 pounds of lunar material that consisted of rocks and dust and core samples and pebbles and all sorts of things. And it's all actually in storage, most of it anyway, at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. And they've been studying those samples ever since. In fact, just a little bit ago, after 50 years, they had kept some samples back, core samples, that they knew that when they first got them, that in 50 years or so, we will have much better technology to analyze these samples. So they've been kept on ice and nitrogen and all that kind of stuff in a vault at the Johnson Space Center, and they just started opening up those just a few months ago. So, like I said, we've sent like some 30 different kinds of probes since then to the moon, including rovers and sample return missions. And this is where the successful Apollo landings were. And you can kind of see, of course, they're all on the near side, and they're all kind of in the middle, roughly scattered around the equator of the moon. It's been estimated we still have 99% of the moon left to explore. So, in the last 50 years, what have we learned about the moon? First of all, it's not made of cheese. So we did leave a few seismographs behind, though, and it turns out that when you slam rocket bodies into the moon, as they did during the Apollo days, to see what the seismographs would pick up, the moon would actually transmit seismic waves about like a block of cheddar cheese rather than the way the Earth does. They say that basically, if they slammed like the LEM or the Saturn S4B stage into the moon would continue to ring for a couple of hours. So, and that is because, the Earth is made of a lot of squishy stuff. A molten core, we've got oceans and a lot of water in the ground and that kind of thing. The moon's pretty dry as far as all that. So it's basically more of a solid mass, and it just rings. So this is what we think the interior of the moon looks like now. So it looks like, first of all, the core of the moon, it still has a solid inner core and a fluid outer core, similar to the way the Earth has. However, the moon's core is like 20% of its overall diameter versus the Earth's 50% core. Okay, the core of the Earth makes up 50% of the diameter of the Earth. Okay, they found out that there's some trace elements of some things. I'm not a geologist, so we'd have to refer to Rob for all this. But basically, this is what the core looks like now. There's a crust that formed about 4.4 billion years ago, and after that crust formed, meteors hit it. We'll talk about that in a minute. And we had subsequent lava outpourings that helped to cool the center of the moon. The moon also seems to have had a magnetic field at one point, but that would also have been back in the day when the moon was still somewhat molten on the inside, like our Earth. Let's see. So one probe that we sent was called Gravity Recovery and Interior Laboratory. I always have to read that. GRAIL. And basically, it was a probe just to kind of measure the mass concentrations on the moon and figure out what's more dense and less dense and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things it determined, like I said before, is that on the near side of the moon, the crust is only like 31 miles thick. On the far side, it's 40 miles thick. So that represents that shift of the center of mass. So, how did the moon form? Well, it's thought that from the data from the moon rocks, that a Mars-sized object, not Mars, but a Mars-sized object, slammed into Earth about 4.5 billion years ago, and it kind of liberated some material that formed into the moon. And both the Earth and the moon cooled and started what we have today. So, once the moon formed, how did it evolve? The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter Project put this little video together of what we think has happened.
The moon likely started its life as a giant ball of magma, formed as the result of a cataclysmic impact event with Earth by a Mars-sized object 4.5 billion years ago. After the hot material collected into a sphere, the magma began to cool, eventually forming a crust on the surface of the moon with the magma just underneath. Around 4.3 billion years ago, a huge impact battered the moon's south pole, forming the enormous South Pole Aitken Basin and sending debris as far as the opposite side of the moon. This impact marked the beginning of a period that would cause large-scale changes to the moon's surface. One by one, more huge collisions shaped the terrain, some forming large basins that would eventually fill in to become the dark-colored patches called maria, or seas. These began as normal craters, but soon changed as impacts continued on the relatively thin crust. Because the moon had not yet cooled on the inside, lava began to seep out through the cracks caused by the impacts. The resulting volcanic activity spread lava throughout the craters, gradually filling them in and cooling. Because of the high iron content in the basalt in the rock, the maria reflect less of the sun's light and appear darker than the surrounding highlands of the moon. About 1 billion years ago, volcanic activity ended on the near side of the moon, as the last large impacts made their mark on its surface. The moon continued to be battered by other impactors, although they were much smaller than the objects that formed its largest basins. Some of the largest, most recent, and best known of these impacts from this period include the Tycho, Copernicus, and Aristarchus craters, which are unique due to the complex system of rays that stretch out from the impact sites. Finally, this is the moon that we see today. Though the surface continues to be affected by impacts, the rate has slowed down drastically to the point that the moon appears unchanging to the human eye, a permanent record of its own history, and a glimpse of how craters may have formed here on Earth.
So the narration credit for that goes to my lovely wife, Karen. So here's an example of how what the last thing was that was said was the moon still changes, and that's because it still gets hit with stuff, just not as much as it used to back in the good old days. So the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, has a project called the NASA Lunar Impact Monitoring Program. So they have a telescope, and it looks at the moon, especially when the dark part of the moon, now there's not a dark side, but there's a dark part. It's like, it gets night here, it gets night there. And so it looks at the night side and looks for flashes. And so this was one of the brighter flashes that it ever saw. Occurred on March 17th, 2013. And the LRO, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, flew over it before and after and took these pictures. And this is about a 59-foot crater that was formed after an impact. So there you go. It's still evolving. So another significant finding that has major implications for human spaceflight is the moon has water. Okay, I mean, it's not lakes and streams and things. However, first of all, they found traces of water in some of the lunar samples that were brought back. Now, it was originally thought that it was a mistake. Obviously, these samples have been contaminated, they've been on Earth, and somebody let some water get in. But other scientists were able to repeat this, and so there is water buried inside a lot of the moon's materials. So, people started thinking, well, where could we find water if it really existed in mass quantities? Well, at the poles. Remember, the moon keeps the same face towards us all the time. And there's a little wobble here and there, right? But mostly it's straight up and down. So there are places on the moon, at the poles in particular, that never see literally the light of day. And so in 1994, the Clementine spacecraft took a series of mosaics looking for where darkness was always occurring. And this is the lunar South Pole. And any place that's dark on this picture never sees light, because basically they mapped it over months and months, and the sun angle was different all the time. And you can see it's really dark in the middle. So in 1998, a probe called Lunar Prospector carried a neutron spectrometer that detected the presence of water ions near both poles. And we've also used radar in those areas, and it turns out the reflections that one gets back in these dark areas is like hitting water ice and not rocks. So, this is the lunar South Pole taken by LRO, and as you can see, there are places there that are really, really dark. Shackleton Crater is right at the south pole of the moon. And in the bottom there, it's really, really cold. In fact, this is a picture taken in infrared. So bright areas here are warm, dark areas are cold. And there's a little spectrum down here that I'm not sure you can read, but basically in the dark areas on this picture, we're talking about being as cold as 25 degrees Kelvin. That's 25 degrees above absolute zero. Absolute zero is the point at which all molecular motion stops. If something gets in there where it's black, it ain't ever coming out because it won't evaporate and it will not sublimate. So it's just sitting there. All right. Now, the whiter, lighter areas there are as hot as about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay. It's 300 degrees Kelvin for those who want to be metric. So, when you get in the dark areas there's a chance that there's water. So, when LRO came, it came with another probe called the Lunar Crater Observation and Sensing Satellite, or LCROSS. And what the mission of it was kind of one way. Basically, they said, what we're going to do is we are going to slam that into one of these craters, and we're going to fly LRO through the plume, and if there's water at the bottom, water ice, we expect to see it to vaporize, create a plume of water vapor, and we'll fly through it and detect it with our instruments. That's a pretty good idea. And they did that, and I'll show you a picture of what they saw. They did not see the water vapor plume, but they did see the flash, and I'll show you that in just a second, and they were able to detect hydroxyl molecules. Now, that alone wouldn't do it, but once again, radar showed that in that same area, there should have been something like water ice. They are pretty darn sure that there is water ice, so much so, they're estimating that it's 100 million to 1 billion metric tons of water at each pole. So, that's pretty incredible. So, this is the little flash that they saw from LCROSS crashing into the crater Cabeus. And this is just different magnifications. And I'm sorry. On the right-hand side of the bottom of the big blob there, that's the highest magnification that they had. So, why is it so important that we find water on the moon? Well, water is, of course, important for life. We need water to drink. But it's got some drawbacks. It's heavy. It's like 8.5 pounds per gallon. And so if we don't find it where we're going, we must take it with us. All right? And so we're always trying to minimize mass. So on the space station, we have a saying, today's coffee is tomorrow's coffee, because on the space station, we recycle the coffee. Okay? And we have a very complicated process to do that, and it's kept under very tight control so that, But that's one of the things we have to do when we're going to space and try to minimize up mass. So this makes it very economically feasible, or more economically feasible if we have water there. Because you can use it, obviously, for hydration for both plants and people, because you want to grow food there. And you can electrolyze water and make hydrogen and oxygen, right? So oxygen, obviously, you can breathe. Hydrogen can be used as fuel. And so it's got, and of course, water for plants, because if you've seen The Martian, as I know a few of you have, it's basically the same principle. You have to add water and other stuff to the dirt, the regolith that it's called, if you're sciencey about it, and you can grow plants. And of course, they've done experiments on the Earth with both real lunar soil as well as simulated lunar soil, and show that it's not that big a deal. So, why go back to the moon? We've been there, we've done that. There have been politicians that have sillily said that exact thing. Well, first of all, the moon's different than it was 50 years ago. It's got water, okay? Let's start with that. But basically, the United States has announced a goal of landing people on Mars in the 2030s. Now, going to Mars is not as easy as going to the moon, and going to the moon is hard. But we're going to go over a few of those reasons right now, okay? So, Why go back to the moon? We can demonstrate the capability to live on another world. You know, we don't really think about it, but this is the only world we've ever lived on, right? The moon is 1/6 gravity. Mars is 3/8 gravity. I don't know if you're aware, but when you go into zero gravity, your body goes through big time changes, okay? Demineralization that's akin to postmenopausal women and the bone loss that you have. You have issues with fluid retention in your head, and it affects your eyesight. There are all sorts of other things that happen as well. Muscles atrophy, all this. But we don't know what the level of gravity you need is to mitigate those. And if it turns out that if it just takes a little bit of gravity, so your bone strength is maintained and your muscle strength is maintained, that's great. If not, there are mitigations that we're going to have to learn about. You're only 3 days away at the moon. Okay, basically, I've got a problem. Point your spaceship at the big blue ball in the sky and go. And you're back in 3 days. Mars may take 6 months to 2 years, depending on where the Earth and Mars are at the moment that you have your problem. Okay? So if you have any kind of problem, medical, solar flares, mechanical failures, whatever, that say, I can't stick around here anymore, you've at least got only a 3-day journey back. We'd like to do something called in situ resource utilization. And what that means is using the resources of the land, if you will, to build things. And like with the advent of 3D printing and things like that, you can use the regolith of the moon, and we'd like to use the regolith of Mars to build things, utilize the elements there, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of titanium oxide, for instance, on the moon, and you can split that up into titanium and oxygen, and you have titanium for building things and oxygen obviously for breathing, etc. We can, as I just said, we can use water to produce fuel. So those are just a couple of examples. But learn how to do that 3 days away, not on the other side of the solar system. And I've already talked about the fact low gravity provides experience in a reduced gravity environment, the work environment, how the human body adapts, things like that. If you have a problem, communications, it's about 1.5 seconds each way. So, Houston, I have a problem. Oh, goodness, what's your problem? You know, you can have a conversation. That's the way they did Apollo 13, for instance. All right? Mars, it can be 20 minutes or not at all, because if Mars and the Earth are on different sides of the sun, you can't communicate between the two. So you've got to figure out, you have to learn how to be a lot more autonomous than we currently are with our spacecraft with people. And of course, Moon has water, so it's got that going for it. So, what's the plan? Somebody asked me, do we have a plan to get back to the moon? Well, yes, we do. So, back in the early 2000s, we had something called the Constellation Program, which was to land people back on the moon by 2015. I was a part of that. And the basic building blocks of almost any lunar program are going to be, you've got to have a vehicle that the crew rides in. You need probably a large rocket to send a lot of mass to the moon, and you need a lander. And the Constellation Program had those three things. The vehicle to get people into space was called Orion, and still is. It's still around. Okay. And in 2010, the president decided to cancel the Constellation Program for a lot of reasons that are good over a beer to talk about. So, however, there had been a lot of progress on the spacecraft and the big rocket. Not so much on the lander, but Congress, in a very rare bipartisan move in both houses, overwhelmingly passed a budget that funded Orion, and instead of the old rocket was called Ares. The new rocket, which looks like the old rocket, is called the Space Launch System, the SLS, okay? Because basically, keep developing these things. One of these days, you'll have a goal, and you'll need these elements. And so, so we kept going. Well, back in March of 2019, the president, the vice president, announced for the administration that we were going to have a goal of making it back to the moon, and particularly the moon's south pole, by 2024. That's really ambitious. However, if you think about it, the first time we did it in 8 years, and we didn't know what we were doing. We have got 50 years of manned space flight experience, as we say, now, and so you'd think that we probably have more capability of knowing what the right answers are, instead of trying to invent everything from scratch. And we have a head start because Orion was being built, and the SLS was being built, and all that kind of thing. So we were directed to use all means necessary to ensure mission success in moving us forward to the moon. So, of course, the big thing will be, do we get the funding? And the good news is the Biden administration has, of all things, decided to keep us going. So we'll see, and Congress just passed a really nice budget for NASA and included money for landers, things like that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The new program is called Artemis. Artemis was the sister of Apollo, okay? The twin sister of Apollo. Now, there's a little bit ominous because Artemis killed Orion, okay? So there seems to be a conflict in the family there. So anyway, that is the name of the new program. And it consists of these 4 elements. Up on the left, you have the Orion spacecraft, and you were on the ship named Orion, and there is a link. Anna Fisher, that was her last project that she was working at NASA, and decided that she would name this ship the Orion. So there you go. Below that is the Space Launch System, big rocket. Then you have a human landing system, and then the new part that you may or may not have heard about is something called the Lunar Gateway. We didn't use that the first time we went, so why do we need it now? Well, we'll talk about that in a second. So, Orion, that's the first part. Looks a lot like Apollo. It's got solar arrays. It's a little bit bigger than Apollo, and so it can take a crew of 4 for as long as 6 months in a quiescent mode, like just orbiting around the moon, and like 2 weeks when everybody's aboard. And this is a little more about the comparison here. So the crew module, compared to the command module, like I said, is a little bit bigger. It's 16 and a half feet in diameter versus 13 feet in diameter for the command module. The Orion takes 4 as opposed to 3. Everybody is going to go to the lunar surface when they go down. There's not going to be any Mike Collins in orbit, waiting around to re-rendezvous and all that kind of stuff. Both systems, of course, have a launch abort Apollo had a launch escape system. We call ours a launch abort system. Ours is much more robust and more capable. Apollo, it was basically a solid rocket that, oh my goodness, the rocket's blowing up, hit the button, and it just kind of takes you off somewhere without regard to where the Saturn V was following you or not. This one knows where the rocket is and will take you somewhere else, which is a good idea. And then the service module, okay, for each one of them. In that case, the Apollo service module, you can see, is larger than our service module. And there's a reason for that, and I'll talk about it in just a moment. And the European Space Agency, by the way, is building the service module for Orion. So the SLS, big rocket. It should be the largest rocket we've ever built. It uses 4 shuttle main engines and 2 solid rocket boosters, like the shuttle, except those were 4-segment solid rocket boosters, and these are 5-segment solid rocket boosters. And if you know what that means, then great. But basically, they're more capable, and they put out a lot more thrust. So, and this is a little bit comparison chart. It's kind of hard to do apples to apples. I threw the shuttle in there because that's what everybody knows and loves. So, and of course, it only had mass. If you look at the bottom there, hopefully you can see that. But mass low Earth orbit for the shuttle was about 22 metric tons. For the Saturn V, 118 metric tons to low Earth orbit. The first version of the SLS, the one that we'll be launching first, about 95 tons. So they're all a lot more capable than the shuttle in terms of up mass. And then the lunar payload, of course, shuttle didn't do anything with the moon. Lunar payload, the first version of SLS is something greater than 27 tons. It hasn't launched yet, and they keep refining the numbers, but right now it's nearly 28 metric tons. The Saturn V was about twice that, 48.6 metric tons. And then we'll talk about the Starship, which Elon Musk is working on. And it's got a little asterisk there. He takes 100 metric tons to low Earth orbit. He takes it to the moon because he plans to launch and refuel the whole thing and then take the whole thing to the moon. So whatever he started out with, he's planning on refueling, and then he's got the full capability to go to the moon. Probably. We'll see. And this is the evolution of the SLS as it's seen in the next few years. The biggest variant is Saturn V capable, if you will. Right now it shows it greater than 46 metric tons, but it's probably closer to 50 metric tons. Now, the lander. So we'll need a lander, but instead of NASA building its own lander, they decided we're going to contract that out and we'll rent landers from bidders, okay? So we just completed a competition and SpaceX won using the Starship design, which is very unconventional. Starship is a very big thing to land on the moon. And if you look at that lower left-hand corner there, you've got an elevator to get you up and down into the actual part where the cargo and the people are. And you have a little person standing there, down there at the bottom. However, Elon has shown that he can put his money where his mouth is, so stand by. It's a kind of a retro-looking kind of a spaceship. You know, that's vintage 1950s right there. And this is a demonstration he just made of landing Starship.
And we have ignition. Starship heading back to the landing zone.
So like the 15th attempt or whatever it was, he nailed the landing of Starship, and that's on Earth where we have atmosphere and everything else, so I don't have any reason to believe that he can't do it on the moon. Gateway. Gateway, just for lack of a better way to describe it, it's like a mini space station, ISS kind of a thing that's going to be in lunar orbit. And it's different than how we did Apollo. Apollo, we sent the command service module along with the LEM, the lander, into low lunar orbit, about 60 miles above the lunar surface, around the equator of the moon, and we plopped off and landed that way. Gateway will be in an orbit that it will be more or less polar, and therefore allows access to any point on the moon's surface. So if you want to explore, it's a lot more convenient. But then the other reason is a real engineering reason, and that is because remember that smaller service module that we have on the Orion? The original concept in Constellation was that as we went to the moon, we'd be attached to a big lander. The lander for Constellation was going to be a big mom. So it and so they were going to do all the orbital correction maneuvers and especially the braking maneuver to get into lunar orbit with the big engine on the lunar lander. Well, Orion's engine was only designed to get you out of orbit and come home. So they don't have enough gas in the thing to do that low lunar orbit kind of situation. Well, Gateway is going to be in a much higher orbit. It is something called a near rectilinear halo orbit, which don't get your head too much around that, but just say it is kind of highly elongated and it takes less energy to get into that orbit from the Earth than a low lunar orbit would take. This also allows commercial ventures better access to get to the Gateway and therefore work on the moon. So they don't have to produce quite as many big rockets. Okay, so resupply is a lot easier. And here's a couple of artist concepts of the initial version of Gateway. You basically have a little habitat there, and you can glom on a lander and maybe a transfer stage and some other things. And then here, Orion is, after that's all up there, then Orion comes up. And this would be how they kind of envisioned the very first few missions working with Gateway. And we call this like a bat cave drawing, okay? The moon's on the top. It's pretty much the orientation it really is, right? And the Earth's on the bottom. And this is kind of how a lunar mission in the Brave New World of work. On the left-hand side there, you have commercial launch vehicles that will send up pieces to the gateway of perhaps a lander or resupply things, all that. And these will be unmanned missions. And once you get all the pieces at the gateway, then we'd send the crew up. They would then land on the moon, do their thing, get their rocks, whatever they're going to do, and then they would return back to the gateway and then eventually jump in Orion and come on home. So that's basically how the mission kind of goes. This is just a kind of a little graphic about the halo orbit. And as I said, basically the big thing to remember there is the closest approach this orbit will actually have. I remember I told you the other one was going to be in low lunar orbit of 60 miles or so. This is the low part of this orbit is 930 miles, okay, and the faraway part, the apoloon, is about 40,000 miles. So it's a much larger orbit and takes a long time to go around. But like I said, it's easier for a lot of spacecraft to get there. Now here's the timeline as currently projected. Artemis 1 on the left-hand side there. First human-rated spacecraft to the moon in 21st century. It will be unmanned, but it'll be the Orion spacecraft, which is sitting at the Cape, waiting for them to finish stacking the SLS, sitting at the Cape, and that'll be the first time they will be put on one another. Then in about a year and a half, we'll send the first people to the moon, and it will be a similar mission to Artemis 1. I'll show you a little video of what that's going to be about. And then we'll start getting pieces of Gateway up there, and assuming the lander shows up when it's supposed to, Artemis 3 in 2024, plus or minus, is when we should land the next man and first woman on the moon. And in the meantime, on the bottom there, what we have is all the other stuff going on to get ready for that. Lots of small-scale cargo missions and explorations by robotics and things like that. I mean, they need to send some probes to the lunar South Pole just to make sure all this stuff I've been telling you about water being there is actually there, and work on ways to getting out of there, because things don't actually work very well at absolute zero. So this is a little video NASA put together about the Artemis 1 mission. So there you go. So just end things, a little video that the Lunar and Planetary Institute down in Houston put together. Just kind of a little fly over the moon just for fun and romance. Hope you enjoy it. This is the Lunar Highlands. And this is an area called Oceanus Procellarum. This is Aristarchus. Tycho, big raid crater on the lunar surface. It has 5 central peaks, so we'll go around. Utah Basin. It's on the east side of the moon. And this is dawn rising over the Tsiolkovsky crater on the far side. Thank you very much for coming.